Well, my demo's here.
All right, shall we begin?
Sure.
All right.
Welcome, one and all, to the Miller Center for this marvelous occasion of having Chris Matthews join us. I'm Barbara Perry. I'm the Director of Presidential Studies here at the Miller Center, and I also co-chair the Presidential Oral History Program with Russell Riley. And I'm happy to say that Chris participated in the Carter Oral History, so he's well aware of the Miller Center and has been a visitor here with us before. Before I introduce him very briefly and let him start speaking with you about his book on Robert Kennedy, I want to thank Stephanie Georgakis-Abbott, who's standing in the back. Please give her a round of applause for planning today's event. Along with the entire Miller Center team. You know, these things don't just happen miraculously and magically, so a lot goes into it, so we thank them as well. Usually when I introduce someone to this audience, I begin by saying when I first met the person or when I came to know about them, but I can't do that for Chris Matthews because it feels as though I have been watching him for my entire adult life. I do recall my colleagues and I in political science at Sweetbriar College, where I taught for 21 years before coming to the Miller Center. We read his books with enthusiasm, assigned them to our classes, and hung on every word of his nightly commentaries on MSNBC's signature evening broadcast. We particularly loved his books, Hardball, Kennedy and Nixon, his biography of John F. Kennedy, followed by Tip and the Gipper, about the amazing political partnership between O'Neill and Reagan. Now we have added his latest work on JFK's brother, Bobby, to our list of favorites. For years, I harbored a secret wish that I might produce a book of my own someday, for which I would be interviewed by Chris Matthews. That moment arrived 5 years ago when my biography of Rose Kennedy was published. Our then head of communications here at the Miller Center initially informed me that I would be interviewed on the Andrea Mitchell report. And I was thrilled because I also admire Ms. Mitchell. And we had invited her to Sweetbriar to speak, and she was terrific. But when the time came for my appearance on her show, we discovered that she would be on vacation. My momentary disappointment was reversed when I learned that Chris Matthews was substituting for her that week. And in a delightful turn of events, he was to be joined by his charming wife, Kathleen. To this day, I keep on my desk a DVD of that interview with the photo of me, Chris, and Kathleen on the MSNBC set in Washington. Among the many reasons that I am a fan of Chris's journalism, commentaries, and books is that they are informed by his unique blend of public service, starting with his Peace Corps tenure in Africa in the late 1960s, enhanced by his speech writing for President Jimmy Carter, combined with his work on Capitol Hill for legendary Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, all leading to his unparalleled observations on life inside the Beltway. And yet he never loses sight of his Catholic roots in Philadelphia. His latest book on Robert Kennedy, titled Bobby Kennedy, A Raging Spirit, which we have for sale in the anteroom after our talk today, is not only a sparkling tribute to Joe and Rose Kennedy's seventh child, but a memoir of Chris Matthews folded into a narrative in a most skilled and compelling manner. Last year, I was asked by Robert Kennedy's daughter, Kathleen, a good friend of Chris's, to organize an advisory panel of historians, journalists, and biographers to imagine a democracy center in her father's honor that will be established in Washington. In our very first conference call with that panel, I was drawn to Chris's insightful and eloquent description of Robert Kennedy's life. I know that Chris will equally impress you today with his moving presentation on Robert Kennedy, whose life and quest for the presidency ended so tragically almost a half-century ago. Please give a warm Miller Center welcome to Chris Matthews.
Thank you, Professor. It's great. I love this place, and who wouldn't love coming down here? I want to give you sort of the Cliff Notes. I'm not going to substitute for you buying the book. No freebies here. But I think what I want to talk about is the thematic of this guy's life. He was not a natural like his brother Jack. Jack was unbelievable. Everything Jack did was like iconic. You know, Jackie's perfect. The missile, it sounded like he figured it out that should be perfect. Yeah, he did figure it out. He was a little bit cold-hearted about that, but Jackie was, quote, the only woman I could have married, Figure that one out. Just think through that meaning. It's pretty frightening. Bobby was in love with Ethel Skakel. I mean, he was in love with her. Jack couldn't figure it out. He said, "You're getting married for life? You're getting married to another person? What's that about?" Jack couldn't figure it out. He was overwhelmed that his little brother would actually get committed to somebody for life. He didn't understand that kind of thinking. We can talk about that. It's fascinating. Bobby was an awkward kid. He was the shortest kid in the family. He was the father. Imagine having your father call you a runt to your face. Nice guy. Not a nice guy. Bobby, somehow through it all, his mother took him to heart. He became her favorite, or sort of a consolation prize, if you will. He could never win the father's love until he became something of an SOB himself. The old man was one, and he wanted one for his son. And so Bobby became a tough jock at Harvard. He really became a jock. Everybody went to school with jocks. Don't go for the romantic notion of them. They're okay. But there's the other side. When you put together oafishness and entitlement, you have a problem. I went to Holy Cross. I know about it. We had him. Bobby became a tough football player. He ended up breaking his leg. He beat Western Maryland. He got a touchdown that game. And later on in practice, he broke his leg and kept playing for a week or so with a broken leg, which is unbelievable. They finally took him out of the lineup, but they put him in for the last game against Yale so he could get his letter. Bobby was a tough guy. He brought his fellow jocks to Hyannisport to meet the old man. They drank his booze, took his cigars out, smoked their cigars, and whatever else they could get, and they didn't like him. But he wanted to show his fellow athletes his brother Jack. And this is another part of the story which is so unusual. Here's a kid, not the favored kid in the family, who loves the one who is, Jack. It's this really a powerful story of love for a brother. I mean, if you want to figure out Bobby, just figure out how much he loved his brother and what he did for him. The other thing about Bobby, there's three things about Bobby. The law, which he studied down here at UVA, his love for his brother, and third, his learning. He wasn't one of these politicians today that come in and act like they were God's gift and they know it all and they never change. Most politicians are like that. They never get any better. They never seem to learn anything. So I want to get to that later because I think that's the one lesson for how we vote for people. Look for people that are willing to learn. The law. He comes down here to UVA. He finally gets serious as a student. He was not a serious student at Harvard. I don't know how you get a D+ average at Harvard. But because the problem is, nobody at Harvard, if you've got kids that went there, you went there, it's very hard to get a B even. B is like a really nasty shot at you from the professor. You get a B. At Holy Cross, a B meant something. At Harvard, a B was like you zero. You just showed up. But he managed to get a D+ average. He got into UVA. He came down here, and he was not really a liberal. Ever, really, but at the end he seemed like a liberal because he cared about minorities, but he was much more like his brother Jack, much more relatively held conservative. He wrote his thesis down here at UVA Law about the 9th and 10th Amendment and how they reserved powers to the states, and he didn't think the federal government, and through judicial decisions, had been doing it right. They'd been giving too much power to the federal government. So he's a classic sort of a conservative on that grounds. He hated Yalta, the agreement which we all grew up with, where FDR dealt with Stalin and basically agreed to the separation of giving Eastern Europe to their sphere of influence. He hated that. He wrote another paper on that when he left here. And so he was pretty much a conservative guy, but he's also a guy who had guts. He brought Joe McCarthy down here to speak. He brought his father down here to speak. His father was attacked by the student paper here. Is it still called the Cavalier Daily? Yeah. They kicked the hell out of the old man because he comes in here in 1951, in the middle of the Korean War, where our guys are getting killed over there, and he says, well, we ought to pull out of Korea. Let's pull out. And by the way, we should pull out of Western Europe. No more Marshall Plan. Give it to the communists. Because we'll have better business opportunities afterwards if it goes communist. Joe was awful. And Bobby had to defend him, so he goes over to the student newspaper, wants to punch the guy in the nose for trashing his father. He couldn't find, he got the wrong editor, luckily. The guy said, I didn't write it. So he didn't punch the guy in the nose. He brought Ralph Bunche down here, the first African-American to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And the president of the school and he had a big fight about it because the state law down here then was segregated meetings only. And the president of the school was going to enforce it. You know, sorry, it's going to be a segregated audience. And Bunch says, I'm not coming if it's segregated. So we're in a time of big transition, of course, in the 50s, even in the early 50s. And so Bobby writes a letter to the President Darden here, Colgate Darden, saying, you know, this is going to look bad for the school if you invoke this rule, the segregation rule. And Darden says, you know what? I'm going to treat this as an academic meeting. This is going to be a class. He just simply said that by fiat. This will be a class so I can integrate. And they did it. They worked it out. But it was Bobby. So that night, Ralph Bunch stayed with the Kennedys, the young family of Bobby and Ethel at their house, because it was the safest place to stay back then. And they were still having stuff thrown at the house all night. It was a scary night. So Bobby had guts. He was not a liberal, capital L liberal. I think he had conservative instincts, but he was trying to put it together like most growing up people are, trying to put it together. How do you put your head together about things, and your heart and your head? And he was trying to do it. His first job was prosecuting corrupt politicians. Not hard to find, up in Brooklyn. That's where he was. That was his first job. He was trying to put those guys away. He was a law and order guy. He thought God's on the side of the law and the other guys are the bad guys. First thing I learned about Bobby Kennedy in my real life, I was a Capitol cop for a while. My first job on Capitol Hill was working at night as a cop. It was a deal I made with a senator's top aide. I had a gun and everything. And it was a little scary that I had a .38 special. But I had one, I packed, and I would work it. The only thing dangerous I did at night was go for dinner up on Pennsylvania Avenue Southeast, which was a tricky neighborhood. The police headquarters had little stars for everywhere somebody had been killed. And we could eat dinner one night at the old Dodge Hotel for $1, all the chicken you can eat, because they wanted uniforms and guns near the cash register. That's what it was like. Hell, Washington is pretty safe right now, but it wasn't back then. Anyway, Bobby, I got to find out that the only liberal Democrat of the senators who regularly said hello to the cops was Bobby Kennedy. That told me a lot about him. The other guys are all snooty, you know, Ribicoff and you know, Fulbright and all. They're walking around with big thoughts in their heads and their eyes at middle distance. You know, the celebrities walk around at middle distance. They don't really see anybody. And that's a nice way to live, but it's awful to live with. Anyway, Bobby said hello to the cops. That meant a lot to me. And just because it was a class statement, he wasn't a snob. And also he's pro-law enforcement. And as I said, that's really the pattern of his career. He leaves here. He's working for the Justice Department at a very low level, but he's a prosecutor up in New York, putting away the bad politicians. And then he goes and his brother calls him up and says, you got to help me in my campaign. I'm running for the Senate, and the old man was messing with it, and he saved that campaign. He got him. He really did get his brother elected to the United States Senate. He got him to beat Henry Cabot Lodge. And beating Lodge is really something, because Henry Lodge was an amazing fellow. Here's this guy who's a United States Senator. He joins World War II. He's over there fighting against Rommel in North Africa. And he has the first American unit to go into combat against the Germans. And then Roosevelt says, you got to make up your mind. Any politician has to decide between office and the military. So he decides he's going to take the military. He gives the Senate seat up and goes fights. He's in Europe. He's fighting in Europe and Yugoslavia. He's good at languages. He's helping the peace treaty at the end and everything with Ike. He's serving under Ike. He comes back and knocks off the other Democratic senator. So, you know, he knocks off David I. Walsh. David I. Walsh had a problem. He was gay, in the closet, and he would go to a gay house of prostitution in Brooklyn frequented by Nazi spies. That's why they always say Jack Kennedy was the first Irish Catholic senator from Massachusetts. They forgot this guy, David Walsh, rather conveniently. It's all true, this stuff. But Jack beats him. He teaches the Irish how to vote for an Irish guy rather than a Yank, which has took them a lot because they always liked Lodge. He would come to the Irish bars and be very condescending, and they liked it. And Jack proved that an aristocratic Irish guy can beat an aristocratic Protestant guy in Massachusetts. It's a hell of a campaign. It was Bobby did that. And then Bobby goes to work for Joe McCarthy, a friend of the family, Irish Catholic. They all liked Joe McCarthy. He was a drinking buddy, good time guy. McCarthy obviously went over the top. He was drunk. He misused and I think abused his role as an anti-communist crusader, ruined the anti-communist movement, really. Best friends the communists ever had was McCarthy. Bobby figures this out about 5 months in. He sees this crazy performance of Roy Cohn and David Shine, their relationship, bopping around Europe, ripping books out of USIA headquarters, and basically doing a book burning expedition in Europe. It was a joke. And everybody figured these are two gay guys doing this weird trip on government money, and it was a joke. Bobby, meanwhile, was investigating the fact that the British shippers were shipping strategic materials to Red China in the middle of the Korean War. And there's the only really good work that McCarthy ever did, Bobby did. But he decided by the summer of, actually late spring of '53, that McCarthy was no good. He went and saw him and said, "You're ruining yourself. You're destroying your campaign against communism, and I'm leaving." Next fall, January, he's back. The Democrats are able to hire a minority counsel. At that time, he becomes the Democratic minority counsel against McCarthy. And he spends most of that time fighting McCarthy. That leads up to the Army McCarthy hearings. Bobby writes the resolution condemning McCarthy for the Democrats. It's a big turn on him because he was still friendly with McCarthy, but he wrote the resolution condemning him. That's an old story about their relationship, something else. Kathleen told me that when he died, he drank himself to death in '57. Bobby was at National Airport driving around. He was so distraught hearing that McCarthy was dead that he drank himself to death. He used to keep the whiskey under the bed at Bethesda Naval Hospital that he rode around the airport 3 times. Bobby just was overwhelmed. He loved McCarthy, even though he condemned him. It's a complicated relationship. But Bobby goes back and runs the Rackets Committee from '57 to '60. He goes after people like Hoffa, horrible mob figures. Giancana, of course, the Godfather himself, Sam Giancana. He becomes Attorney General, first guy ever to really go after the mafia. J. Edgar Hoover, for whatever reason, despite the G-men and the Tommy guns and all that stuff, when you go visit the FBI building, I think still today you get the guy with the agent comes out, the special agent with a machine gun, and puts on a show. He never believed there was a mafia. Well, Bobby believed there was a mafia and started off, when he became Attorney General, trying to get a list of all the mafia leaders in the country. They just had their big meeting up in Appalachia up in New York. They knew who they were. Finally, he puts the list together. Mort Kaplan, the professor of tax law down here, he brought him in to head the IRS for one reason. They're going to catch the mob leaders, and they're going to use tax records to do it, the way they got Capone. And Kaplan, I interviewed him. He's 100 and something now. He's still practicing law at Thomas Circle in New York. In Washington. It's astounding when you go meet the guy. He's got the bow tie on. He's still going to work in the morning, 103 or 4 or something. There's nothing wrong with being 103 or 104, by the way. As Frank Mankiewicz once said, "Oh, he died at 84. That's not a bad run." Yeah, he said, unless you're 83, which is so true. So Bobby was a lawman. He says hello to the cops because he identified with them. He was going after the bad guys, even when they were the communists. He wanted to get them. He wanted the crooks in the labor movement. These characters he went after. There's one guy. He was an arsonist, and he like burns himself to a crisp in his final. What do you call it? Final. What do you call those things? His final hit, whatever you call it. His final. Arson, and the guy's burnt to crisp, and the guy trying to interview him said, he's Irish Catholic, probably G-man. You're about to meet your maker. Can you tell us the truth how this happened? The guy's just the worst language in the world. The guy, he's burnt to a crisp, and he's just yelling this stuff back at the guy. These guys are hardened bad guys going after, including Giancana. Of course, later it gets very complicated at AG because at the same time he's prosecuting Giancana. The Eisenhower administration and the Kennedy administration, the CIA were using him to get Castro. This got very complicated. And of course, Giancana didn't like that. You're using me to get Castro, to knock him off. At the same time, you're prosecuting him? Prosecuting me? What's going on here? In the meantime, Jack's sleeping with Giancana's girlfriend, Judy Campbell. It's all true. And Bobby's got to deal with this. So Bobby, one of the things he does, I don't know if I can tell you the whole book here, but Bobby, as the law enforcement guy, has to go see Jack and says, first of all, you got to get rid of the Sinatra character. He's mobbed up to the teeth. Get rid of Sinatra. He's hopeless. And because he's the one that sort of introduced him to Judy Campbell via, despite her relationship, nice friend there. Despite, I'd like to meet this one. She's a nice one. She's going out with Giancana, but he won't mind. It's unbelievable. So he has to go tell him to drop the relationship with Judy Campbell. And he never did that generally because he knew Jack had this thing for what Jack called girling. That's what Jack called it. And it was obsessive. And Bobby had to shut the door on that and shut the door on. Sinatra gets so furious, of course, you probably heard this story. Jack was supposed to go out to Palm Springs and stay at Sinatra's place, which was a big honor for him, this Rat Pack guy. And he gets the word, the president won't be coming. He'll be staying at Bing Crosby's house. Now, there's the two white guys are both the best jazz singers in the country, especially Bing, and their rivals, obviously. I mean, historically, they are it, these two guys. And Bing's a Republican, well known to be a Republican. And so Sinatra gets a sledgehammer and goes out to the helipad that he had built for the president's for Marine Wonderland and smashes this thing. Imagine that scene. He was really smashing Jack Kennedy's head is what he was doing. And then he became a big Nixon guy, you know, and a Reagan guy. But this is Bobby. He's the enforcer. He's the archangel. And it went on, of course, civil rights. You all know the history of that. Old Miss, he was the one that brought federal troops in from Memphis. And he said, if anybody lays a glove on, or lays a hand on James Meredith, the first black student, shoot him. This is Bobby talking. He went up against George Wallace and basically pushed Wallace to the side. He made sure he put a real tall National Guardsman to go tell him to get out of the way. He handled that without any problem. So, I mean, a lot of his life was law enforcement. In fact, when he first got to be Attorney General, he went down to Atlanta and spoke at the law day down at the University of Georgia and said, okay, integration under the courts is one of the laws I'm going to enforce. I believe in enforcing laws, and that's one of the laws I'm going to enforce. Got it? He basically said, it's not about race. I'm just going to enforce the law to the Southerners. So his whole life is this sort of tough role and playing the role for Jack in politics, the enforcer. He'd go into rooms with like Mike DeSalle, the governor of Ohio, and he'd come out of the room and DeSalle was just beat up. I mean, he's going to be for Jack. He did the same thing with Governor Tawes of Maryland. When you're dealing with Bobby and he's working for his brother, when the law, I mean, he comes in with his love, he'll do anything for Jack. It's a tough guy. He's a character. And he was always learning. What I loved about him, because I mean, most of us try to get ahead in life by learning and getting better all the time. Jack was sort of Jack all the time. He had to do speech lessons and a few things like that, but Jack was pretty much a finished, elegant guy. Ethel would tell me Jack would walk across. She would say one time I was interviewing her at Hyannisport, she said, look at how he walks. He's perfect. Well, obviously she's talking about her husband not being perfect. She's talking about Jack being elegant, the way he held a golf club, everything he did was elegant. Bobby was awkward from the time he was a kid. He once ran into a window inside the house and smashed his head because he was afraid he was late for dinner. He was so determined to impress the old man. Jack wouldn't do something like that. Jack was his own guy. Bobby was always trying to get smarter. He developed, down here as a student. He developed as Attorney General, running the Rackets Committee before that. And in all the civil rights fights, he's always trying to learn. He learned about McCarthy not being the hero he thought he was. He learned about how to get through the Cuban Missile Crisis, I guess the greatest thing he ever did. He understood that we couldn't attack Cuba even with the missiles there. These missiles were capable of reaching every American city but Seattle. They were intermediate range. They could reach 3,000 miles. They were not defensive weapons. Castro did not put those weapons in to protect Cuba. He put them in there because Khrushchev wanted to equal the balance, strategic balance with us and them. It was for Soviet purposes. But he knew that if we went in there we attacked those missile bases, we'd kill a lot of Cubans and a bunch of Russians. And he said, I don't want to be in charge of Pearl Harbor in reverse. We're not just going to attack another country like that. And he also was worried, like his brother, about what would happen in Berlin, because the belief was pretty clearly if we moved on Cuba, they'd move on Berlin. And we couldn't stop them in Berlin without using nuclear weapons. We would have to go to tactical weapons in a matter of hours. We were outnumbered 10-1 in terms of ground troops with the Warsaw Pact. So he was smart. He had a fight with Curtis LeMay over this. He goes out and drops the leak, you'd have to call it, to his friend Georgy Bolshakov, who was his buddy from TASS news agency, who was really an agent of the Russians. And he said, look, if we take our missiles out of our Jupiter missiles out of Turkey, will you take your missiles out of Cuba? And that was the deal. They ended up striking. He had to go see the Soviet ambassador, and he put the deal together. and he'd save the humanity probably from a nuclear war. So Bobby was the smart one in the back room. And I'll leave the rest of the story to those who read the book, because it's really about a guy who was never really comfortable out in public as much as he was smart, being his brother's brother in the back room cutting the deals. And later when his brother died, he never really could get over it. I think he was trying to, the rest of his life from 63 to 68, trying to bring back what he had before, his brother and him running the country. And there's a great scene. Chuck Spaulding was standing out in front of the Lincoln bedroom, and Bobby's in there crying because Jack had just been killed that day. It was that night, and he was saying, God, why have you done this? I mean, Bobby is very religious. He thought he was talking to God. He wasn't just praying. It was interactive. It was real, and he never got over it. And the rest of the story, I thought about it a lot, was Bobby trying to bring back what he had, and he couldn't do it. And Lyndon Johnson was in the way. That's another story that's in there. They hated each other. It's an amazing story about growth and love and the law. And it really started down here. Bobby really grew up down here in law school. And he couldn't have done what he did with his brother's career if he hadn't been down here for 3 years and doing what he did down here. Well, thank you. Thank you.
Chris is going to take a seat, and I'll throw out a few questions to him, but we know that you have index cards that you've been writing your questions on. So we have Alfred and Stephanie in the back, and they're going to come down the rows and take your questions on your index cards. So please feel free to hand those around. Don't be shy. Hand their cards off to them. So first of all, the book is so good that I have 2 copies. And the first is the galleys that came from my colleague Brian Craig, who is on our research team here in presidential oral history, and he works closely with Simon & Schuster. And so when there are new books coming out that he thinks that we should be interested in, and he knew I would be certainly scooping this one up as a Kennedy aficionado, and he was right. And he said, we've got to have Chris come down. So I'm so glad that this was able to work out. But I wanted to go back to something that you've just said in your theme today about Bobby Kennedy's learning. And maybe compare or contrast, however you wish, that to his pragmatism and his brother's pragmatism in politics. And I'm thinking about this in reference to civil rights particularly. Certainly here he was growing and learning, and you see the key and the sort of the core of him in the Ralph Bunche situation. But we also know that they had to be very pragmatic about civil rights, especially at the beginning of the presidency. In the 60 campaign, the beginning of the presidency with the Freedom Rides and the Freedom Riders. Can you take us through his odyssey from the 60 campaign, the Martin Luther King springing from jail, the Freedom Rides, and then when they get to June of 63, where they finally push forward and say, this is a moral question. The president goes on national television, makes that brilliant speech. The 64 Civil Rights Act, thank goodness, is put through. And then bring him up to his campaign and his outreach to minorities.
Well, let me do it as the 2 brothers together, because in 1956, Jack Kennedy was seen, when he ran for vice president in Chicago at that convention for the nomination, he was seen as a moderate. He was not seen as a lefty Democrat. He was a moderate, meaning a very strong Cold Warrior, anti-communist, military guy. That's why he did incredibly well in the South among Southern delegations, despite his religion and all. That wasn't a big deal then in 56. It was more like, well, he was a ticket bouncer with Adlai Stevenson, was Protestant and divorced. They need a little balance there, the other side. So he was playing a part there. But he was very popular as a war hero. I mean, I remember growing up seeing him on Navy Log, that TV show. I mean, he was like one of the heroes of the show because of what he'd done saving his crew. And he had, of course, swam for 4 hours carrying Pappy McMahon on his back, and his back was bad enough already, Kennedy. So he was a war hero. And he also voted for the jury trial amendment to the 57 Civil Rights Act. And the jury trial, basically, if you think being for juries is a pretty American thing, but in the South in those days, if you could get if your juries were white, if you get a white jury in a civil rights case, you're going to get acquitted. And so when you have to go with a surfer, somebody abuses their authority or whatever, police chief or whatever, they go before a white jury, they're going to get off. If it's a bench decision, a judge decision, it might go the other way because the judge is looking at the law. They're looking at, their sentiment, the public sentiment. So he was seen as not really pro-civil rights because he had voted for the jury trial. Although you could argue that was the only way to get to your pragmatic point, that was the only way that bill was ever going to get through the United States Senate with this filibuster rule then. The filibuster rule then was 2/3. Think about 11 states, the old Confederacy, that's 20. It's very hard to get 67 votes for any kind of civil rights bill. Of course, you had conservatives out west, too, and Goldwater and people like that later. So you had enough conservatives to prevent a civil rights bill. So he was pragmatic enough to be for the jury trial amendment. And then when he got into office, the brothers were really worried when Dr. King was arrested in the fall during the election campaign. Jack's instinct when Harry Swofford and Louis Martin, I know both of them, one was African-American, Louis Martin, were working for Kennedy. They said, you have to do something for Mrs. King. Just call up Mrs. King and console her. At least do that. And Jack says, why not? He calls her up. Bobby finds out about that. He goes crazy. He said, you and your bomb thrower is going to cost us this election in the South. Because you have to remember, back in the 60s, very few blacks voted in the South. Very few were allowed to vote. In the North, it was obviously positive for the Kennedys and the Democrats in Philadelphia, New York, Detroit, Chicago. That's all positive for them there. But in the South, they were just going to get themselves in trouble. And Nixon was popular enough by 60. He'd be more popular in the South by 68. But they had to make a decision. So they end up, Bobby ends up going to the governor through the governor. Jack calls the governor. They go to the governor. They go to the judge. And they get him out. So Bobby was, as always, learning how to do things. He, first of all, thought it was a bad idea to call Mrs. King. Then he said, no, we got to do something. He got mad at the judge for throwing the book at this guy for a traffic violation, basically. Out of state driver's license kind of thing. And then later on, I think in Ole Miss, he didn't want to bring in federal troops until he saw how angry the crowds were. I mean, 2 or 3 people got killed. That Ole Miss crowd in Oxford were awful people. They were just terrible in dealing with this integration question. And so he didn't want to escalate because they'd seen what had happened under Eisenhower bringing troops into Little Rock. They did not want to. Nobody wants to bring troops into their own country to fight their own people. Nobody wants to do that. It looks awful and it is awful. And so they did everything they could to avoid doing that kind of extreme action against George Wallace. And they did succeed there. But, the Freedom Riders, he didn't like the Freedom Riders. He said, why don't you guys stay at home? Why are you causing trouble? He called them up, and says, get them off. He'd have Louis Martin, call up your buddies at Harris Party. He said, call off your buddies and stop this thing. We're fighting a Cold War, and you're trying to create incidents in the South showing segregation. That's exactly what the commies want to see. Stop it. But they did do it. And then Bobby changed because he sent John Siegenthaler, who was Tennessee, his top guy, down there, and he got his head bashed in with a lead pipe down in Alabama, and Bobby changed. He had blood in the game. He goes, you know what? These people are no good. They just beat up my guy for just being there. And so he began to change. To me, the most important scene in the story of Bobby Kennedy on race was he thought he'd done a lot. He thought the black leaders would all be with him and love him for what he'd done because he had secretly raised all the bail money from the unions, secretly to get all those kids out when they went and protested against the fire hoses in Birmingham. He did all that behind the scenes. He got King out of jail. He thought he had good street cred with the black leaders. So he agrees to sit down with all these intellectuals like James Baldwin, Harry Belafonte, all these writers that were raising his son, and 20 or 30 very sophisticated New York black leaders, cultural leaders, and he sits down with them, and they beat the hell out of him. And in fact, this one young kid's, I'm not going to serve in Vietnam. And Bobby couldn't believe they're that left wing. He said, what are you? And he left that room. He was so mad at them for Belafonte not backing him up. And yet, he starts to think, and over the next week he says, if I were them, I'd be them. I'd be them if I were them. I'd be thinking like they think. They've been closed out of American life. And now we're telling them to go fight the wars for us. And he sits with his brother in the Oval Office. I've got a movie of this, Robert Drew's movie. And you see him in the movie, Professor, you've seen that picture, where he's telling his brother, you got to go on national television for civil rights. And Jack doesn't want to do it. He says, no, you got to do it. The next night he did it. Bobby is so central to this story. And he's always learning. He never has the right instinct the first time. As I said, he's awkward, but he would learn. He'd learn from black leaders who would give him a hell. And then he'd go, you know what, they're right. He's always doing that. He's always learning. And most people in politics don't. They're the same character they were when we first met them. They don't, Barry Goldwater came out for the 18-year-old voting age because he's on the floor one day. And somebody said, what about, we're drafting these kids at 18. You know? He said, okay, you're right.
He also came out for gay rights.
Later on.
Later in his
later
life.
life, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, these conservatives all come out for the liberal positions when they retire. But then again, Pat Moynihan came out against late-term or partial birth abortion when he retired. So a lot of the true beliefs don't really come, their philosophy beliefs don't really come out till they're free to speak. Charlie Dent, Bob Corker, Flake, Jeff Flake, Ryan Costello. I never even heard of these guys until they started talking. And they're all, I knew Costello. It's either an Irish or Italian name. I got to find that one out. I like to know this stuff. He didn't start talking until I said, well, he must be going to retire because he's talking against Trump. But we were talking before, I mean, the Republican Party is very loyal to Trump. It's 84% the latest. It's remarkable. The old line is Democrats fall in line, Republicans fall in line. It's very low. It's very low. That's his great strength right now. Guys like Cornyn in Texas, and he's a reasonable guy, and Mitch McConnell is a very political guy. They're sticking with him. So interesting.
Well, we will perhaps get even farther into these subjects of current interest. But I read all of the Kennedy books that come out, and I'm always looking for new things. And among the new things that I discovered in your book is your theory about Robert Kennedy that you point out is different from many observers of Robert Kennedy. You say that he always had this compassionate streak in him, and that it just comes out more as life goes on, and that many people who've observed him say, oh no, he was a hard son of a gun, and it was only after Jack's death that came out. Tell us about how you came to your theory.
Have you ever met anybody who's changed?
I have to ponder that one.
I don't know these people that change. I mean, basically people are the ones, you go to a reunion of college 30 years later, it's him. I know, maybe we put them back in their boxes again, but people, there's nuances. I just know that when he was the youngest kid, he would hang around with people like Dave Hackett, who was the model for Finney and Separate Peace, the book. And Hackett was the superstar jock, and he would talk about, we got to do something for poor people. The writer, we got to do something for poor people. And then he would, when Father Leonard Feeney, who was a priest back at Harvard, who hated Harvard, the Jews and everybody else at Harvard, he hated them, railed against them, he came out saying no salvation outside the church. And Bobby wrote a letter to the bishop, to Harlan Cushing, raising hell about this. His mother was scared to death he was going to get excommunicated. Feeney ended up getting excommunicated. Bobby was, there's a lot of signs of the Bunch thing where he showed an instinct that you would call liberal, and but also maybe better just charitable. Everybody, I thought the best line I came across was Arthur Schlesinger said that Jack Kennedy was a realist, brilliantly disguised as a romantic. And we used to talk about this in high school. A friend of mine, a super basketball player I went to school with, George Smith, ended up going to Duke. He said, I think Kennedy is not a romantic. He's a hard politician. And he figured that out in high school. That's a conservative guy, a friend of mine. And Jack was a hard, cold person. He was frightening in many ways. He would just cut you off. And Bobby, on the other hand, was tough, but he had the heart. Bobby, as Schlesinger said, was a romantic, something that's disguised as a realist. And he covered for his brother. That's why his brother was popular as hell, and Bobby was the one. When Jack was shot, Bobby said, I thought it would be me. Because he had been leading the civil rights thing. They thought it was a civil rights opponent at the time. It turned out to be Oswald. But Bobby was the one who carried the torch.
Tell us, Chris, about the key to Robert Kennedy's ability to draw support from both white working class and minorities.
You figured that one out, and you figured out the problem with the Democratic Party today. You've got it. That's it. That's one of the reasons when I ended up writing the book. I didn't write it with the intention, but let's look at this guy here. Let's look at these people here. When I said he's the only one that said hello to the cops in the morning, look at that family. obviously enlisted guy in the military, perfect salute. His kids saluting with him. Because we used to, when we were kids, we looked like this. Dirty, you know, you didn't wear a shirt in the summer and you're dirty and poor as hell white. These are dirt poor white people. Look at the other pictures. You got policemen saluting him.
This is along the tracks of the funeral train.
This is, look at that family in perfect regimental order. This is a strict kind of family we grew up with in the 50s. I did. You know, the father getting them all in line perfectly in age. Black people cheering, blacks cheering and singing in the Philadelphia 30th Street Station, singing Battle Hymn of the Republic, and they know all the verses. Church. They sang the whole song. And white people just affectionate patriotism. That's all going for the Democratic Party today. Nobody sees the Democratic Party as the patriotic party. It's gone. They're sophisticated now. You know, Carole King concerts.
I'm sure you know, Chris, that the Miller Center.
It's not enough. She's wonderful, Carole King, but it's the wrong. It's not the message Democrats are saying. More Springsteen concerts. Connect with real people. Don't talk about how if you're Nancy Pelosi, I can raise the most money. Don't say that this weekend. And that's why I'm the leader. That is the problem. Too much talking to their donor class. Too much talking the issues of their donors. You know, I'm sorry, we know what the issues are. And they're not the issues of the working class people. The working class people's concern is, I want Social Security, Medicare. If I got a long-term problem like Alzheimer's, I need Medicaid. And I want my kids to have a job so they can live close enough that they can drive home. That's all they want in Scranton. They are not greedy people. That's all they want. And the Democrats won't deliver. They think that's below them. They're deplorable people. And they paid the price. And the people said, if I wasn't invited to the party, screw you. They've had too many parties without invitations to the regular people. And I absolutely believe this. It's cultural as well as economic. And they won. Their elitism has cost them the affection of the working people of this country. It's absolutely true, and they do not want to hear it. They want to say, well, we didn't get the black vote out enough. We weren't liberal enough. Right? Try that one again. Run Bernie again. Run Bernie. You can actually probably get Trump to pay for it. An old Bernie. Revolution. Revolution. Chris, you don't understand. It's a revolution. No, it's not. No, it's not. There is no revolution, Bernie. You've been selling that since, as Howard Feynman said, you're like the student in 1960-something with a bullhorn yelling to the administration building. What's he used to say? Non-negotiable demands. Howard's got a whole number he does on this. That's who Bernie is. And I do think that's true, and I think Bobby was able to get those guys because we were talking this before, patriotism. I mean, Jack almost got killed. His brother Joe got killed. They had instinctively patriotic guys. And Bobby got in the war. He gave up a chance. He was in officer's training. He didn't want to be an elitist. He didn't want to be an officer. He wanted to be an enlisted swabby just to get on the boat at the end of the war. And I think that's who they were. And maybe, I think it was to make up for the old man in many ways. But they were real Americans. And you know, I think the average working class guy said, yeah, I get it. They're one of us. And I think that's that's just been gone through Clintons and all that stuff. It hasn't been there. It's not the same. It's not the same. And they become Reagan Democrats because Reagan seemed like that kind of guy.
Well, real historians hate these questions, but I'm a political scientist, so I can ask it, and that's the what-if question.
Well, there's no doubt about the answer to that question.
Right. So
I don't know if he would have won, but if he had won, I think he would have kicked Nixon's butt because Nixon was so scared of him. I've got a partner, Nixon's watching Kennedy announce for president, and Nixon's out in Oregon, the Benson Hotel, and he's watching the television. And at the end of the television, somebody turns off the television, and Nixon keeps looking at the television. And he's staring at it. He said, remember that quote in there? It's like, forces will be unleashed we cannot imagine. It was like something out of Indiana Jones. It was like the forces, like the Ark of the Covenant. The Kennedys are back, and he was overwhelmed by it, you know. And but I think the Humphrey thing, you can't predict, because in those days we didn't have that many primaries. They only had Indiana, Wisconsin, New Hampshire, California, Oregon. So most of the delegates were under the controls of governors and party chairs. Who knows? If he had won California, which he did, if he had won New York 2 weeks later, which would have been problematic because the West Side liberals didn't like him, but if he had won that one, then he would have come around the country, as he said, chase Hubert Humphrey's butt around the country. I think here's the one thing. In 1964, he walked into the Democratic Convention in Atlantic City. I was a busboy back then. I remember going over there that night, collecting some souvenirs. And when he walked in that room, they cheered for 19 minutes straight. It was, you got to look at the tapes on the YouTube. You can't believe the affection for him. I think if he had done something like that in '68, maybe it would have been like that. If he'd walked into that, instead of students throwing turds with razor blades in them at the cops and stuff like that was going on out there. Horrible. Look at the faces. These weren't students. A lot of them in Chicago at that convention. Take a look at their faces. They weren't students. Some of them were. They're just troublemakers, and the cops were terrible. The cops were, it was a police riot. Instead of that, suppose Bobby had gone to that convention as the leader of the anti-war movement. You would have him against Humphrey. Give me a break. That would have been a show. And instead of, and all of us in '68 watched every minute of that. I watched every minute of that. I was at Chapel Hill. I didn't miss a minute of that convention. We were going out for Arby's and red wine, and we were watching every minute of that thing. But if it had been Bobby there, G. McCarthy had given up by then. If Bobby had come in there, who knows? But I'll tell you, if he had won, the war would have been over, because it would have taken a leader like him to say it, and the Vietnam Memorial would be half as filled. And I think our country would have been. But I know one thing, because he wasn't there, the division we have in this country right now was there then. Town against gown, hard hat against long hair, police against people. All the divisions that we see in our country right now, father against son in those days, is all there now. And that vicious divide between you remember the hard hat guys against the construction workers? Bobby Kennedy, according to Jack Newfield, said Bobby thought of cops, waitresses, construction workers, and firefighters as his people. What Democrat can talk like that today? And so I think the union of the country, look, Trump has brilliantly exploited our division. Brilliant. He's tapped into it. And he knows exactly the language of it. Barack Obama doesn't belong on the list of presidents. It's an asterisk next. Like Barry Bonds, he doesn't deserve it. Get him off that list. Get his face out there. He knows who he's playing to, but the first 20%, and the second 20%, he goes after him on the rapists across the border. And since the Democrats don't have an immigration policy, and they don't have a trade policy, and they don't have a tax policy, and I don't know what they have, except they know how to raise money, he can walk right through it. He's just accused the Democrats of being for open borders, and until they say otherwise, that's what people think. And it's easy. He just exploited it brilliantly. And he's getting his 40 to 45% that way, and he'll probably have it next time. And the way he's holding it, in fact, he's doing a little better now. So he could have 45% going into 20 if he runs again. We'll see. But the division is the thing I care about. And I don't think the Democrats have figured out how to end the division. They got to end it. They got to go for the Reagan Democrat again, and they got to make it their case to them that they're going to look out for their concerns, and they're going to stop being snobbish about it. I think. That's just my view. We all have different takes on this. But I'm right.
Well, we have some intriguing questions from our audience.
I don't know I'm right.
Here's one, Chris, for you. Are there any Bobby Kennedys in the back room today?
The closest, this is one of my pastimes, trying to figure out who the Democrats should run. I got a whole dozen VP candidates. I got a lot of VP candidates. Who's got the heft of Donald Trump? The heft. Who's as big as he is? They can take him on one-to-one in a room. Next to him. When it comes down to it, instead of that room, that arena, you stand next to the person, who can beat him? Well, Hillary was pretty good. I think she's good in those debates. I don't think that was her problem at all. In fact, although she might have come up with a better move when he was hovering over her. I don't know what the right move for a woman is. Nobody's figured that out. A guy can say, get the hell out of here. Or you know what a guy can say? Turn around, look at him up and down the way George W. did to Gore. And that killed Gore. Most guys said, you got in his space, you shouldn't be president. Why did Gore go in his state? Why would you do that? He asked him, what about Dingle Norwood? What? That's so Gore. What about Dingle Norwood? So John B. had no idea what he was talking about, which is probably a smart idea not to know what he was talking about. He goes like this. And every guy in the room knew what he meant. Geek. I don't know what a woman does. What's a woman do? A guy comes towering over like the Phantom in the cartoon. He's just looming over there. What is a woman supposed to do? I don't know what it is. If a woman turns around and says, hey, Buster, get back in your box. The trouble is Trump is so damn good at it. He would have retorted. He is so good at that back instant reaction. I don't know if that's the talent we wanted a president, but I'm beginning to think we need it almost. Like, what do you say if it always comes down to, in Trump world, every minute is isolated from anywhere else at any time in the universe, that minute. You know? That's why he's always tweeting, because he wants to control that minute. There is no past, there is no future, just this minute. Minute by minute by minute. And we go on the air every night, usually around 6:30, sometimes 7:30, we're on the show live, breaking news, Trump's done something again, or somebody's broken something about him that doesn't seem to hurt him. We think these are staggering new breaking stories. This will kill him, this one. No, it doesn't kill him. It's just more about him. And you think it's news, and it is news, but Trump, he apparently gets up at 6:30 in the morning. He gets up 5:30, I heard that, but he gets the New York Times at 6:30. He reads the New York Times, and then he tweets. And that sets the agenda for the day. And if anything happens, he tweets again. He has found a way to live in the second or the minute. And it used to be, I would tell young press secretaries, I was teaching them, I'd say, do radio, because radio refreshes every 2 hours. They have to have a news story every 2 hours. So don't waste your time getting on television. You probably won't get on television in a big city, so do radio. And everybody, I remember hearing the word Nixon when I was 2 years old. Right? Like, Nixon, I didn't even know what he was. I just said Nixon. You want to get in that oral area. You want to get in where people hear the word. It's like memorizing telephone numbers. Do it orally. You won't forget it. Don't try to memorize what the numbers look like. Memorize what it sounds like, and you'll remember the phone number. All the digits. Try it sometime. So that's how our minds work. So it's radio, but now it's tweeting, and it dominates the what used to be called the news cycle. This news cycle now is like peripatetic, and he masters it. And your question was?
Let's go to the next one. How would Bobby relate to the Mueller investigation?
Well, he probably would have enjoyed the prosecution part of it. I think he liked being a prosecutor. He always seemed to like it. He likes these Manichaean, bad guys, good guys, you know. Because, I mean, who would have lived in, he doesn't know anything about the world we live in. Bobby was killed in 1968. He didn't know anything like this, what we lived through. He doesn't know anything about it. I'm working in the television something called cable. That didn't exist. The kids today don't know what it is to be on the telephone without seeing the person. You know that? They don't know what that world's like. They don't know. Everything is brand new. Bobby had to go to that black community in Indianapolis and tell them Dr. King was dead. Hours later, he told them. I mean, I got the old tape where he says, "Do they know yet?" And he said, "No," and he has to tell them. Today, everybody would know everything immediately. I learned I was in the stacks at Chapel Hill in the library in the basement, and somebody came and told me. But everything's instantaneous now. And again, what was the question?
What would Bobby think about the Mueller investigation?
What do you think about the fact that this Saturday night on SNL, a porn star goes on television playing herself and says to the President of the United States, the storms are coming? What? And it's all true. This is the world we live in. This situation with this media hound, Avenatti, who knows how to get, I shouldn't say media because everybody is now, I guess. He's on the air all the time, Avenatti, the lawyer for Stormy. I don't know what he's got left to reveal. I mean, this non-disclosure thing doesn't mean anything. I mean, it's all over the place. Everybody knows who she is. Everybody knows who Stormy Daniels is. What more is there to tell? And somebody said, one of the former unnamed former Trump guys said, everybody believes he had the affair with the woman, and everybody believes he paid her. Everybody, this is a fact. That's one where Rudy is right, because he might as well admit it. When you're given, it's rolling disclosure, everybody believes it. And we're talking about this stuff now. Stuff like this did go on before, but not like on television and prime and Saturday Night Live stuff and talking about Stormy and it's weird. And there's a lot more of this stuff coming. Don't you think? Did you see what Rudy said yesterday? Well, there are other cases like this? He said, probably. And he's defending them. I mean, it's beyond. I mean, Jack Kennedy had a relationship with, we were talking about before, Inga Arvid, who was accused of being a Nazi. She had a picture, she had covered Goering's wedding, one of his weddings, and had a picture thing with Hitler, and that was a problem. And J. Edgar Hoover was chasing her around as a Nazi, and Jack and he and her were down at the Fort Sumter Hotel for 4 days. Because
this was during the war.
He said, yeah, this is during the war.
Not while he was president.
With a Nazi, assumed Nazi, and Hoover had them bugged. Hoover's a little weird. And he had them bugged, and the only time they came out of the hotel was to go to church.
Rose Kennedy would have been pleased.
It's just true. And then later on, before he died, fortunately, serendipitously, this didn't come out till later, but he was he'd go over to the Carroll Arms Hotel next to the Senate building. You know where that is?
I do. I was an intern
I was
there.
I was with the Senate Budget Committee there when I was working for Muskie, and that's where they used to have the Quorum Club, and that's where Smathers and a whole bunch of them had benefited from the fact that Bobby Baker would get them girls. And one of the girls was Ellen Romash, an East German spy apparently, and one of Jack's. It just is, it can't, I mean, Giancana's girlfriend, Ellen Romash, in the middle of the Cold War. He always had one for each war situation.
War is
They
hell.
live dangerously. I mean, it's just, behind the scenes, I don't think it's, with Trump, everything's different, but it's not like they were all like clean jeans before this thing.
Well, Chris, I have a great question from one of our graduate students here who's studying foreign policy. And it's, could you speak about the relationship between Robert Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, particularly the televised debate that they had
Oh, you must
Vietnam.
be a conservative, right? That's all right.
We're nonpartisan.
My
here
family is mostly conservative. Yeah, they had Frank Mankiewicz, who was Senator Kennedy's press secretary, set up a debate. And like most liberals, underestimated Reagan. And Reagan cleaned his clock. And Reagan wasn't dealing with nuance. And he was tastefully taking the anti-communist cause. And a bunch of lefty students, it was the Oxford or something that was a British thing, British production. And Bobby was trying to be nuanced. It's always harder to be a liberal, because if you're a liberal, you're somewhere between socialist over here and right-wing over here, and you got to do nuance. I don't believe in socialism, but I do believe in certain social programs like Medicare, Obamacare, things like that. I believe in limited government, but more than most libertarians would want. So it's always a harder argument to make, because you can't be clear-cut. You can't be, government's is the solution, government's the problem. Well, you can say that, but where does that get you? You do have a government, and you want it to work, and you want it to be efficient. So you can't just say, we hate government, then you get the worst people in the world working for the government. You have to look up, you got to build up public service. You got to say people working for the government are doing a good thing. They're not making a ton of money. They do have job security in some cases, but they're good people if you want them to do good jobs. Somebody once told me years ago, people don't do their best work when they're being peed on. That's an understatement. If you keep dumping on government bureaucrats, you'll have the kind of people that are willing to be those kind of people, to be dumped on. You won't have good people going into government without pride. And I think in the Kennedy era, they would have signs on the walls of all government offices, serving in the government, it's like serving in the military. You're fighting for your country. You're doing the good work. Pride. And Trump's not helping that. He's dumping on he's calling FBI people who are gutsy, good, mostly Republicans probably, stormtroopers, when they get a judge to give them a warrant. Now, that's all constitutional. That's not stormtrooper. Because he just wants to dump on, Rudy did this the other day. That's not good. It's like the NRA referring to hobnailed boots, But I do think that the discouraging and dismissing public service is just, you go to DMV, it's not going to be any better because you dump on the people. It's not going to be any better either way, maybe, but there's some places you just have to deal with,
Let's end on a high note. What's Robert Kennedy's legacy for American democracy and politics?
Well, I think it's probably looking out for runts like him. overlook people. I think his identification, it wasn't this Irish thing he always talked about. I think that was overdone. He always talked about the Irish need not apply and all that thing. He never experienced any prejudice in his life. And that all ended before World War II anyway. I think it was looking out for people that politicians don't look out for. Looking out for people living in the Mississippi Delta, where kids are living on molasses, just enough sugar to keep walking, dying every day. Indian reservations are a problem. We have never really figured out those. There's a great movie came out a year ago, Wind River. Wind River is out in Wyoming. It's a pretty rough country, and we sort of ignore it and let it sit there like this is there. We don't have to worry about it. But it is part of our country and our history. And the California farm workers who weren't even allowed to unionize, and they were legal. And I just think looking out for people that are overlooked, it's a big part of it. Politicians don't normally. He would campaign. He'd be fighting for president, but he'd stop off at Indian reservations. There's no votes there that speak for him. I think that, and keeping your roots, too. I really do think that, I'll go back to something I've been pounding on, which is if you don't say hello to the cops, what are you doing as a lawmaker? They're enforcing your laws. You got a problem with that? If you don't believe in enforcing immigration laws, you shouldn't be in Congress. You're making laws. That's why you're here. You're not here because you're nice. You're here because you're here making laws. You're going to make laws, liberal, progressive, but you're going to enforce them, right? You got that? Are you going to enforce them? I want to hear that from people. I don't hear it. I don't hear them saying, I will enforce the law with any enthusiasm. And that's why Trump can walk right through them now, because he says, I'll build a wall. What are you guys going to do? Nothing. And so I think honest law enforcement. Bobby would say he wouldn't have taken a Black Lives side or the cop side. He would say, I want good cops. I hate bad cops. I don't like Bull Connor. I don't like the judge that arrested King and threw the book at him. I don't like those guys. But he would have loved, he did love cops that did their job. And I think we have to believe in good law enforcement. It's part of public service. And stop taking sides. Every time there's one of these Black Lives situations, I go, tell me the facts. I want to know the facts, because some of the cases are clearly police brutality, and the guy chokeholded that guy. Some of them are easy. And shooting the guy when he's running across the field, they're easy. Michael Brown is not an easy case. Some of these cases are hard to figure out. You go, what would you do if you're the police officer? And maybe because I was a cop briefly. I think one thing about being even a little bit of training I had, you learn something about what it's like a cop. Do you know when the cop stops you when you're going along the road and you're speeding? Everybody speeds. You're speeding. Everybody speeds. Everybody speeds. So you're stopped, and the cop doesn't walk up to the front window. He comes to the back window, and he reaches over at an angle. You know why? I think it's a women's picture. I think Jimmy Kimmel had it right. He said, women are still mad at men right now. They're going out with fish. And I thought that was so great. And we were talking about that with her in agreement. She has other ideas besides politics, which I love in a politician. Just tell me you're interested in something else, serious music or something that you get a little bit of a sort of a soul. You're actually interested in something besides getting ahead. And she might be it. And we'll see. I like this guy, Mitch Landrieu. He gave the best speech at the Gridiron this year. He really is a tough guy, strong, insistent, kind of a guy, if you will, tough, very good with black relations. He tore down the statues. I don't agree with him on all this stuff, but he's impressive, and so is Garcetti. I don't like Garcetti's father much, but he screwed up the OJ case. But I think Garcetti's interesting. I think he's Jewish, Spanish, and Italian.
Great combination.
You gotta cover all the bases.
Well, with that, please give Chris a warm thanks from the Miller sisters.
Thank you to escort you to the book signing.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris. Chris will be outside to sign your books.